So in this second part of this lecture, we look at different materials used for climate reconstruction. And it all has to be some sort of material which contains different layers that sit on top of each other, so that you can have a sequence of events. And the first material, or the first type of core that you can look at, are sediment cores. And this is about sedimentary layers and the principle of superposition. And we're talking about the oceans, where sediment, because it's a little bit heavier than the ambient fluid, it settles, ends up on the seabed and forms a layer, becomes compacted, and you have a sequence of layers that reflects the atmospheric conditions. So you have layers of different thicknesses and different chemical properties and different types of isotope ratios. And this one example is the colorful walls of the Grand Canyon are the result of differences in the mineral composition of the rock. Okay. Many of these contrasts are attributable to the differences in marine versus continental deposition, as oceans covered this region at various times in geological history. Here we go. So these are the different layers, and we can identify a layering also in sediment cores from the bottom of lakes. And above my head is an example of the bottom of Lake Shira in Sri Lanka. Okay, you can see different layers here, darker layers and brighter layers, difference in the colors reflecting different concentrations of organic material. And indicated here is also a dating going back to 1945, and you can identify different layers, events, okay? Climate events you can identify here. Okay, what else can you use to reconstruct climate? Another thing that you can use, we do that on the next slide, but this one is more about sedimentary layers. Indeed, I need to show you this example of the Flinders Ranges. The oldest mountain range in the world. Formation of the Flinders Ranges began about 800 million years ago. And ancient sea covered the area for about 300 million years, depositing sediment over the area. And in these times when the area was in an ocean, the area was the seafloor of the ocean, you get these horizontal layers that you can nicely see. Horizontal, different type of layers that you can see. And the Ediacara Hills in the northern Flinders Ranges is the site of discovery of some of the oldest fossil evidence of animal life. It also contains evidence of 49,000 years of indigenous settlement. So this is a very precious region in Australia, in South Australia. Okay, so you can look at another different type of material that preserves information from the past due to the principle of superposition. And yes, you guessed it right, ice cores. Ice cores from regions where you have a continuous ice growth. How do you get that? You have a region where you have every year you have a snowfall, and the snow accumulates on the surface and becomes over time compacted, preserving air bubbles. Okay, so from these air bubbles you can retrieve information of past climate conditions, including temperatures and CO2 concentrations and methane concentrations and stuff like that. Here's one example that I show you. It's different sections taken from the Greenland ice cores, which altogether is 3 kilometers long and contains the climate record of at least the past 110,000 years. And you can visually see different layers, in terms of different colors. Okay. We also have the first long Antarctic ice core recording atmospheric conditions over the past 750,000 years. And ice records are so cool because they actually resolve seasonal variations. You get very fine, a very fine temporal resolution in these records. Okay. Tree rings. Let's talk about trees. Okay, we cut through a tree. Each ring in a tree corresponds to a growing season. So each tree ring that you see corresponds to 1 year, where the first year growth is in the center of the tree, and then you can count the age of a tree. You can determine the age of a tree from counting the number of tree rings. Okay, going from the first year growth to the outside. Okay. Discovered by Douglas in 1929 from the University of Arizona, who noted that the wide rings of certain species of trees were produced during wet years and inversely narrow rings during dry seasons. So in this example here, you can identify wet years and distinguish from dry years. And you can date. So you have it all together. Okay, and one example here shows you some example from actually a tree that does no longer exist. You have a tree which started to grow in 1527. Okay, and then you can determine some climate conditions from the past. Here in this example, climate conditions from the past is 16th century mega drought, including that condition. This is pretty cool. You can actually retrieve information not over the past 100 years, but we're talking about the past few thousands of years. Okay, from trees. Okay, corals. Corals also contain layering. Okay, as corals grow, okay, they also record certain types of climatic conditions. This is one example from the Great Barrier Reef, from Brook Island and Havana Island. Okay, examples of a core taken from a coral. And you can see that there are different layers. There are some bright lines and some dark lines here. And the bright lines in the corals are produced from humid acids from terrestrial plants which are washed into the sea by rivers and deposited in the corals as they grow. Okay, so you can derive information on actually the river discharge, on times of flooding, of excessive rainfall, you get higher river discharges, and in times of drier conditions and droughts, you have reduced river discharges. And this is a reconstruction here of, it's actually data here of the Burdekin River discharge, and where you can see the alignment of different lines, So that's important information that you can retrieve from corals on past climatic conditions. Okay. Speleothems. Okay, it's another way of retrieving climate conditions, because these structures, there are mineral deposits formed from groundwater within underground caverns, actually grow over time. So they have information on the timing. Okay, and we have two different types of speleothems. We have structures that grow from the ceiling, called stalactites, and dripping stuff onto the ground, forming stalagmites. Okay, and the stalagmites grow from the ground, and the other ones grow from the ceiling. Okay, and you can cut them into parts and determine isotope ratios, and then you can compare them with ice core records. And that's what I'll just show you one example, not going into the details, but just see that you can line them up in terms of the dating, and you can number and identify a number of events. Indeed, sometimes it's a little bit tricky because the cave, it might be at a totally different location compared to the ice core. You essentially only get the stalactite record contains regional climatic changes, and it might be different to the ice core. However, you might be able to actually determine common events, which are global events of climate change. Yeah, it's mind-blowing. Think about it a little bit, okay? All right. So now you know about all these different type of materials that you can use, and there is two important questions. Okay, what you want to know for each method that you're using. What's the time span? And what is the resolution? Let's talk about these two very important terms. We're talking about, firstly, the time span. Okay? The time span of a paleoclimate proxy record determines how far back in time climate conditions can be reconstructed. Tree ring records span the most recent few thousands of years. Ice core records go back as much as hundreds of thousands of years, and fossils can be up to hundreds of millions of years old. Okay, that's one thing, the time span. The resolution is something different. The resolution of a time series tells us how much detail is to be found in a given type of proxy data. Each ring in a tree corresponds to a growing season, so tree rings records provide a resolution of 1 year. But that's different for sedimentary records. They don't resolve every other year. Okay, they have a much lower resolution. So the interpretation of these records is very important for you to know what is the resolution. And I summarize the time span and the resolution of records in this table. Okay, so what's shown in this table is not a table, it's more a graph. Anyway, so what's shown in this graph is on the top axis, it shows you the time span of the record. And going, this one is in a logarithmic scale here, so you have on the right 1 year, then 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, and so on. It's always times 10. One unit here, or one change between these ticks. And it ranges from the time span of record from 1 year to 1 billion years. Okay? And it shows you different type of records that you have. You have instrumental and historical information going back 100 years, maybe 150 years, something like that. Tree rings can go back a little bit longer. Ice cores, even longer. We go talking about 100,000 up to 750,000 years. And also, it's that. Lake sediments go back, some go back a little bit longer. Coral reefs, ocean sediments, and you even go into the order of million years. And continental coastal sediments even longer. However, there's also the resolution of records as shown here in the bottom part of this graph, ranging from 1 month to, it's essentially 1/10 of what's shown at the top axis. Okay, 1 month would be a seasonal resolution. Okay, if you have measurements every month, you resolve the seasons. Okay, and tree rings contain that information, and ice cores contain that information, and indeed, and then instrumental records contain that. But on lake sediments, you don't have it anymore. In ocean sediments, you don't have that anymore. ocean sediments at times don't even resolve years. Okay, so that all plays a very important role if you interpret sediment, if you interpret these samples. And indeed, tree rings can't give you any information. So from these very long, old records, we don't have any information on year-to-year variations or seasonal variations or so. All right, so study questions. Which method is commonly used to date samples from the geological past? What is a climate proxy? What are stable isotopes? Which stable isotopes are used to reconstruct the paleoclimate record? What is the principle of superposition? So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. In the next lecture, we're actually looking at the reconstructions of past climates. Okay, we look at temperature variations over the past million years. That will be very fascinating. Okay, thanks for tuning in.